Well, hello and welcome to week 6 of Liturgy and Pentecostal Ministry. Yes, it's week 6, 3 more weeks to go. Actually, 2 weeks of discussions, of class work, and then you will have the 1 week to finish up your paper. But let me just encourage you, please, don't wait for that last week to start writing. In fact, some of you haven't even submitted your topics yet, and that concerns me. Seriously, it really does. You need to be researching your papers now, and you really should be starting to put together your outline, your thoughts, and where you want to go with this, because you don't want to wait another week or two, or you certainly don't want to just begin that last week of class. All that pressure of trying to get it done. Sometimes, I mean, if you're like me, it's just really hard to work under that pressure. So please um, start writing your papers, get that research done. And just speaking of that, remember that you are allowed or you're required to use three references. And I'd really like to see you use theological books, references. But again, like we've been saying, since you're not close to libraries, most of you, you can use articles from ATLA. If you don't know what ATLA is by now, I think it might be a little too late. But anyways, get your articles, get your sources from ATLA. If you're writing on the Lord's Supper, just type in the Lord's Supper, just like you did for your extra credit, some of you, and find those articles on whatever topic. You can find them on ATLA. Again, I'm just going to reiterate, you are not allowed to use articles from the internet. You cannot go in there, and I've said this before and I'll do it again. You can't go in there and find what John MacArthur said about foot washing. You might be hard pressed doing that, but I'm just not going to take it. That'll be, marked off. So again, I'm just trying to reiterate theological sources. And if you use articles from ATLA, then you're okay. Just in that, listen, I'm looking for you to engage your sources, not necessarily quote them. Please don't put long quotes in this short paper. You'll get marked off for that. You can say that so and so suggests this concept, and you can reference that, on page so and so of the article or the book. But don't give me long quotes. I want to hear what you have to say about the topic and about what your sources are saying. I want you to engage them. That also goes with Bible verses. We want you to engage the scripture. We want to be scriptural in our paper, in our thoughts, in our theology, but don't give me long Bible quotes in the paper. That just takes up too much space. Again, reference the Bible, put the reference there. We can go there and read it. Don't give me long quotes on that. Okay. I hope I'm making this plain as I can. And I want you to succeed in your paper writing. I'm looking forward to reading all those. As we begin this week, this is a very important topic for me, the Lord's Supper. This really is, the theology behind it, the practice of it. This is what brought me into my understanding or my work on liturgy and the ancient the ancient traditions of the church, trying to integrate them into our modern Pentecostal worship practices. In fact, this is what I did my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation on. It's there in the syllabus page. If you want to use that as a reference, you're more than, I'd be pleased for you to do that, to engage that. But this is really where it began for me. And it began for me with the resource that I want to share with you today, and that is Dr. Chris Green's monograph on Towards a Pentecostal Theology of the Lord's Supper. I was introduced to this in 2012 when I graduated from the seminary with my Master of Divinity. I was there at the graduation waiting for, my diploma. And of course, they were having to go through all kinds of things. And the seminary has a connection with Bangor University in England. And so there are people who get PhDs from Bangor who get it through the seminary, through Dr. Chris Thomas. Anyways, there was a young theologian, Dr. Chris Green, or Chris Green at the time, who was getting his PhD from Bangor. And they read his dissertation title, Towards a Pentecostal Theology of the Lord's Supper. And it hit me. I said, what? Is there a theology, a Pentecostal theology of the Lord's Supper? I don't think we think about that much. I mean, we just participate in communion, maybe 2-3 times, maybe 4 times a year, right? And just, not that big a deal. But he wrote a complete monograph, a PhD dissertation on Pentecostal theology of the Lord's Supper. And so I just had to read that. And I introduced myself to Dr. Green, and we began this relationship. And I read through his book. In one of the chapters, he offers 6 exegetes of 6 passages from the Bible that speak of communion, that speak of the Lord's table. And after I read that section of his book, those 6 passages and the way he exegetes them, I was convinced after reading that book that in my ministry, and again, I was graduating from the seminary, I was just going to be appointed to my first church in Alabama, rural Alabama. I was convinced that somewhere along the line, I would have to bring that church and or even any church I was in to a place where we would receive communion weekly. That's how powerful that book effect was on my life. That after reading his book, after reading his passages, his commentary on these passages, I was convinced that I have to practice communion, not just once a week, but as often as possible. That's how strongly I feel about this. And now, not only did I do that in Alabama, and I write about it in my doctoral dissertation, but this is what we do at New Covenant Church of God here in Cleveland, is we receive communion every week. And it's just that strong of a practice for me. And so, I'm really, into this. And this is very important for me, a very important chapter, a very important week. And I'm just kind of going on about it. And I don't want to get too geeked out about it, okay? But just on Dan's book, as well as Chris, they just go together. Dan's chapter, then of course Chris's entire book. But both of them give this beautiful history of it. Dan does a wonderful job of offering kind of a history of how the church engaged communion throughout the ages. But he also engages other traditions, right? Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox specifically, and specifically for Roman Catholics, he talks about the Roman Catholic practice of transubstantiation. And of course, just by stating that, he's not saying this is what we believe or this is what we should go to. He's just basically engaging these traditions. And we want to be careful, Dan is not trying to make us Roman Catholic. It's just good to engage what other people believe to help us kind of solidify what we believe. One of the other beautiful things Dan does in this chapter is he speaks about this sacrament as a blessing. And he really gets into this idea of this sacrament, specifically the Lord's Supper, as being efficacious. How are these practices spiritually beneficial? And perhaps, not perhaps, but I'd like to, if you're going to write on foot washing, or if you're going to write on, baptism or the Eucharist or laying on of hands, the oil, I'd like to hear how, these practices, not just are symbols, but how are they efficacious? How are they spiritually beneficial, not only to us as individuals, but to the life of the body corporately? How are these participating in these practices, these sacraments, efficacious? Let me give you an example. As a Pentecostal, and I think, I could probably guess that you would probably have the same background or same experience that, when we take communion, we want to make sure that all of our sins are covered, that we're doing this in a worthy manner, right? We talk about that. Why? Because by taking it in an unworthy manner or taking it with perhaps unrepented sin, that you could become sick or you could die. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've had actually people tell us that, right? You got to make sure, and think about how many people are afraid to take communion because of such a strong understanding that there's something spiritual going on. Well, what if we took that at the other direction? That if you receive communion, there are benefits, that this is efficacious, again, for our lives individually and corporately. I mean, there's so many ways that we can speak about communion and the theology behind it. It's deep and it's beautiful, and there's this way of us coming to the table, right? And Jesus says, "What? Do this in remembrance of me." Well, what do we remember? Well, of course, we remember his death and resurrection. He gave his life for us, and in that we also remember our baptism, right? Where we die and are resurrected, and that we are crucified with Christ, and that our life is to look like Christ's cruciform life, his cross conforming life. And so there's all these things that we remember. And not only that, we even go back further, right? We remember Israel's deliverance from Egypt and how they were taken out of bondage, out of slavery, and they were delivered, and how, in a sense, Christ is our Passover. And so there are these historical events, the deliverance of Israel out of bondage, Jesus' death on the cross, and how these historical events inform us and what it means to remember. There's also this idea of remembering the promises that can be found at the table, where Jesus tells us that he is coming back again, his second advent. I can't help it, but just in a couple of weeks, we're going to be going into the season of Advent. And in there, we remember Jesus' first advent, and in light of his second advent. And so Jesus promises to come back, and at his return, we are going to feast at the marriage supper of the Lamb, and where there is an abundance, and the kingdom life is overflowing, and the joy, and just the peace, and all that is involved there is ours. And so there is this idea of the table, the Eucharistic table, and really all the sacraments, but this beautiful, think about the table as being this time machine where we can reach back to the past and pull resources and bring them into the present. And what does it mean for us today? But we also reach forward into the future and we bring them into the present. So there's this idea of reaching back and reaching forward and bringing them to the present reality of where we are today, and what are the benefits, what is the efficacious nature of all these things kind of converging in the right now. And so as you read and as we discuss, I hope this kind of comes out in your reflections. I'd really like to see what you have to say about that. Just a quick note about James Smith chapter this week. I don't have a whole lot to say about that, but he is, reminding us of the importance of passing these practices down, these liturgies down to our children. This is the call of Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 6, where we have the Shema, right? Where, this teaching of the oneness of God, and that we are to pass this idea down to our children. And now this is our task in the church, and the liturgical moves that we can make to form our children. But Smith will kind of offer a critique about the way we kind of divide ourselves intergenerationally. We have our children over here, we have our youth over here, we have our older seniors over here, and how we divide ourselves. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's good to have ladies come together and have a meal together and share the things that are pertain to their lives as women. And it's good to have men to come together and kind of share our struggles and life together in that way. But I think we need to be intentional. And I think one of the challenges that we face, and I am very strong about this, one of the challenges that we face is that our children, once they become teenagers, especially once they kind of become 18 and out of the house, so many of us have seen our children and other people's children leave the church. And what's going on there? And I have a theory about that, that in the 1970s, we had this idea that, you know what? Our children need children's church. We need to have a separate church for our children. It took place in the 70s. Children's church, children's ministries, well, we've had them a long time, but children's church specifically started in the 1970s. And if you track that, ever since the 1980s, 90s, and now into today, our children have had a hard time finding their place in the worship service because we have them in the nursery. And then we have them as children in children's church. And then think about it. Who is our children's church workers? It's our middle school students. And then by the time they're in high school, they get into our services and they are just clueless. They have no idea what's going on. You can see it. It's just this challenge. And I might be overstating it, but I think James Smith does a good job about warning us about dividing. And right now I'm in a reversal. We're in the mode of we're keeping our kids in the sanctuary during worship, and we have different ways of doing that. We have a children's sermon. We have ways of integrating them into the life of the church during the service. We actually have a table we have on the side of the church where during the sermon they go there and they write or color or have an activity that goes along with the sermon. They're listening, and yet there's this activity. And while it's somewhat of a challenge with noise and stuff, there is this activity going on that creates this cohesiveness of we are the body of Christ and our children are part of that. And so think about that as you read through James Smith's chapter today. And again, I'd like to hear your comments on that. And just to emphasize this, you need to comment on both books, both chapters, chapter 6 of Tomlinson, chapter 6 of Jamie Smith. You need to comment on both. Give me quotes and questions from both, because that helps me to know that you are reading both texts, okay? In closing, you have one more opportunity for extra credit. I think 3 of you, maybe 4 of you got the ATLA. I'm surprised about that. That was such a simple, exercise. But you do have another opportunity. And if you see from how I graded this reflection, you see how I'm going to grade. Some of you are going to get C's on your paper, and you're going to want to get some extra credit so you can get an A in the class. And so that's not a threat. It's just a warning that go to that liturgical service and just get an easy reflection on that. The hardest part about that is just going to the service, right? It's going to take you an hour. It'll probably take you 15 minutes to write your reflection. So just giving you that. Listen, get writing on your papers. If there's any priority of this class right now, let's get that paper going and writing, because that's a huge part of your grade, and you're going to want to get that in on time, because, again, as soon as the class closes, I grade those papers and I turn the grades in. And once I turn the grades in, I can't change anything. So if you don't have your paper in by that final day, that'll be a huge hit on your overall grade. So just keep that in mind. Okay, looking forward again to engaging the Lord's Supper, which is very dear to my heart. And I hope you have a wonderful week. Let me know if you're having any challenges. I'm here for you to help you through that. If you need help still navigating ATLA, I'm more than happy to guide you through that, okay? Have a good week. We'll see you online. Bye-bye.